The wasteland stretched far under a red sky. The ground was cracked like broken glass, and the air was filled with the smell of smoke and metal. This place had seen many battles, and tonight it was silent, except for the sound of footsteps crunching. Against the ash, the human commander walked slowly across the battlefield, his armor dented, his blade covered with dust. Around him lay the remains of a brutal fight, broken weapons, blood-stained sand, and fallen soldiers from both sides. But his eyes were fixed not on the dead, but on the living, from behind a half-destroyed wall. She appeared tall, fierce, with bronze skin and dark braided hair that fell like a warrior's crown. Her eyes burned with the fire of defiance, even though her wrists were bound by energy chains. She was the leader of the Amazon squad, and she had fought until the last breath of her warriors. The commander stopped and studied her. She stood tall, even in defeat, shoulders straight, chin lifted, as if chains were nothing more than decoration. Around them, the surviving human soldiers whispered, pointing at her with fear and curiosity. They had seen her fight, a storm of steel, moving like a shadow, striking faster than their eyes could follow. Many of their brothers had fallen to her blade, and now she stood before them as a prisoner. One soldier spat on the ground. "Kill her, Commander. She deserves no mercy," another muttered. "She's too dangerous, too proud. She will never bow." But the commander raised his hand and silenced them. His gaze did not waver, his voice calm yet sharp. "She is mine." The words echoed like thunder. The soldiers looked at each other in disbelief, some with anger, some with fear. To take an Amazon as a slave was madness, they thought, for their spirit was unbreakable. But the commander had made his choice, and no one dared to question it. He stepped closer to her, their eyes locking. For a moment, the battlefield seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them standing in silence. Her lips curled into the faintest smile, not of kindness, but of mockery. "You think chains make me yours," she whispered, her voice like steel scraping stone. "You know nothing of me, human." The commander did not answer. Instead, he reached and gripped the chain. Pulling her forward, his soldiers watched as he led her through the wasteland. A strange sight, a fierce warrior queen walking beside her enemy, bound but unbroken. The campfires of the human army glowed in the distance, casting long shadows on the barren land. As they approached the camp, soldiers gathered, curious and restless. Some shouted insults, others laughed, but the Amazon's gaze never wavered. She walked as if she was still free, her head high, her steps steady. The commander noticed this, and deep inside, he felt something strange. Not pity, not fear, but respect. In the camp, she was tied near the commander's tent, guarded by two men. The firelight reflected in her eyes. Sharp and unyielding, she did not beg, she did not cry. She simply sat in silence, staring at the flames. The soldiers kept their distance, uneasy under her presence, even in chains. She seemed like a predator among prey. Later that night, the commander brought her food. A simple metal plate of bread and water, nothing more. He placed it before her, but she did not touch it. Her voice was calm, cold. "I do not eat the food of slaves." The commander studied her, saying nothing, then walked away, but her words stayed in his mind, sharp as a blade. The wind howled across the wasteland, rattling the tents, carrying the smell of smoke and ash. The Amazon sat unmoving, like a statue carved from stone. Her people were gone, her freedom taken, yet her spirit was untouched. In the shadows, the commander stood watching her, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. He had claimed her as his slave, but he already knew this was no ordinary prisoner. This was a storm wrapped in chains, a fire that refused to die. The wasteland was quiet again, but beneath that silence, a new story had begun, not of a master and a slave, but of something far more dangerous, a bond forged in war, where respect clashed with pride, and destiny waited in the darkness. And so, the night passed in the wasteland camp. One man, one Amazon, two warriors bound by chains yet divided by worlds. Neither would bow, neither would break. And in that tension, the seeds of a story greater than war were sown. The night in the wasteland. Camp was restless, the fire cracked, sparks flying into the dark sky, while shadows moved like silent ghosts between the tents. The human soldiers laughed, drank, and sharpened their blades, but their eyes kept drifting toward the chained Amazon, sitting near the commander's tent. Even in silence, she disturbed them, her presence heavier than the battlefield itself. She sat straight, her wrists bound in glowing energy cuffs, the blue light reflecting against her bronze skin. The guards nearby shifted uncomfortably, speaking in low whispers. "She doesn't look like a slave," one muttered, glancing at her. "She looks like she's the one watching us," the other replied, his hand tightening on his spear. They laughed nervously, but deep down, they knew the truth. She was dangerous, even without a weapon. The commander emerged from his tent, his armor removed but his eyes sharp and watchful. He scanned the camp, then walked toward her, the firelight casting his shadow long across the ground. She looked at him as if she had been waiting, her gaze calm but cutting. "You chain my body," she said softly, "but not my spirit." The words carried like thunder through the air, making the guards glance at each other in unease. The commander crouched in front of her, his voice steady. "Spirit alone will not keep you alive here." Her lips curved into the faintest smile, a smile not of joy but of defiance. "Then perhaps death will," she whispered, refusing to touch the food that lay beside her, untouched since the evening before. The commander studied her for a long moment, then stood, leaving her with only the fire and the silence of the night. Hours passed, and the camp began to sleep, the laughter fading into snores. Only the wind and the shifting of armor filled the darkness. The Amazon's eyes never closed, watching, waiting, calculating, every sound, every movement. She marked in her mind. She could have run when the guards grew tired, but she did not. Escape was easy, but her pride was greater than her freedom. At dawn, the sun rose red through the haze of smoke, painting the camp in light. The commander ordered her brought to the training ground. Soldiers gathered in a circle, curious and eager, wanting to see the spirit of the Amazon break. He placed a heavy log before her, the weight of stone and iron. "Carry it," he ordered, his voice firm. "Prove your strength." The soldiers laughed, whispering to each other, expecting her to refuse, but she rose slowly, her chains clinking, and lifted the log onto her shoulders. Her muscles strained, sweat sliding down her skin, but her eyes stayed sharp, locked on the commander. Step by step, she carried it across the sand, never breaking, never falling. When she reached the end, she dropped it with a thud, standing tall again, her breath heavy but her pride unshaken. The men fell silent, their laughter gone, replaced by something else, respect, mixed with fear. The commander's expression did not change, but deep inside, he felt the same. This woman was not broken, and maybe she never would be. But instead of weakness, he saw strength, and that strength burned in his mind like a flame. Day after day, he tested her, giving her tasks meant to crush her spirit. She cleaned weapons with her chained hands. She carried water from the wells. She faced the mockery of soldiers without a word. But in every task, she held her head high, refusing to bend. Her silence was more powerful than any scream, her pride more dangerous than any sword. At night, he found himself watching her again. The way she sat by the fire, unbroken, unafraid. The camp grew restless, whispers spreading. "She is no slave," some said. "She is something else." Even the younger soldiers stopped laughing, instead avoiding her gaze, as if afraid her eyes could cut deeper than any blade. One evening, the commander brought her food again. She looked at it, then at him, her voice calm. "Why do you try to feed me? Human, you claim me as a slave, yet you treat me as if I am more." He stared at her, his voice low. "Because you are not like the others." Her eyes narrowed, the firelight dancing in them. "No, I am not like the others, and neither are you." The words lingered between them, heavy with meaning. She was his prisoner, yet she spoke to him as if they were equals. Something shifted in that moment, something both of them felt, but neither spoke aloud. The soldiers noticed it too, though none dared say it. The camp was no longer the same, because the bond between the commander and the Amazon was no longer just master and slave. As the night deepened, she sat once more by the fire, her chains glowing faintly in the dark, but her eyes held no defeat, no weakness, only the silent fire of a warrior waiting for the right moment. And in the shadows of the camp, the commander watched her again, his heart conflicted. He had claimed her as his slave, but in truth, he was the one caught in her chains. The days in the wasteland camp grew longer, each one heavy with dust and tension. The human soldiers kept their distance from the Amazon now, no longer mocking her, no longer laughing when she passed. They had seen her carry burdens twice her weight, endure the heat of the sun without a cry, and face their insults with the silence of a queen. She was chained, yes, but her spirit walked free, and that freedom unsettled them. The commander, however, was not unsettled. He was curious. He had fought many enemies, seen warriors crumble under the weight of chains, but never had he seen one who grew stronger in captivity. So he decided to test her, not with simple labor, but with trials that measured something greater than muscle. He wanted to see if her pride could break. On the first morning, he led her to the sparring ring. The soldiers gathered, eager to watch, their voices buzzing like restless insects. The commander threw a dull practice blade at her feet, the energy cuff still glowing. On her wrists, "Fight," he ordered, his voice steady. "Show them what you are without freedom." She bent slowly, lifting the blade with chained hands, its weight heavy but familiar. One of the younger soldiers stepped forward, eager to prove himself against the slave. The duel began, steel clashing in sharp echoes, the Amazon moving with grace even in chains. Her strikes were fast, her footwork flawless, and though she could not move as freely as before, she was still stronger, sharper, more precise than the soldier. Within moments, he was on the ground, his blade kicked aside, his pride shattered. The crowd grew silent, unease spreading again. The commander did not stop there. He ordered another soldier forward, then another, until 3 faced her at once. She fought them with fire in her eyes, each strike precise, each movement filled with controlled fury. She did not win easily this time, but she did not yield, and when the dust cleared, she still stood, bruised and chained, but unbroken. The commander stepped closer, his eyes fixed on her. "You fight like the chains do not exist," he said. Quietly she lifted her chin, her breath heavy. "Chains exist only if the spirit accepts them." Her words struck harder than her blade, and even the soldiers who hated her could not deny the truth they carried. That night, as the camp settled, the commander visited her again. He placed food before her, but this time, she reached for it, eating slowly, her eyes never leaving his. It was not submission, no. It was something else, a choice. For the first time, she accepted what he gave, not as a slave taking scraps, but as a warrior acknowledging another. The commander tested her again in the following days. He gave her tasks meant not just for labor, but for honor. Cleaning blades, repairing armor, tending to the wounded after a raid. She completed them all without complaint, her hands steady, her pride unshaken. Some soldiers began to whisper that she carried herself like a leader, even in chains. Others feared that her presence would break the order of the camp. One evening, after another long trial, the commander found her sitting by the fire, her gaze lost in the flames. He sat across from her, the silence between them heavy. Finally, he asked, "Why do you fight for pride when defeat is already yours?" Her eyes shifted to him, sharp and steady. "Because defeat only comes when I choose to surrender, and I have not chosen." The words stayed with him through the night, circling in his mind like echoes he could not silence. She was his prisoner, his slave in name. Yet she walked taller than most of his free soldiers. He began to see her not as a captive, but as a mirror, showing him what true strength was. Not just muscle, not just skill, but a will that no chain could crush. As the days turned into weeks, something strange began to happen. The soldiers, once hostile, now avoided her insults, some even showing signs of respect. When she walked through the camp, chained though she was, heads turned not in mockery, but in wary admiration. It was as if she had reshaped the air around her, bending it to her spirit. The commander knew the truth. His tests had not broken her. They had revealed her, and deep inside, though he did not admit it aloud, he felt a dangerous thought growing. She was no longer his slave, at least not in the way his men believed. She was becoming something else, something he could not yet name that night. As the firelight flickered across her face, the commander watched her again. She met his gaze without fear, without hesitation. In her eyes he saw the reflection of a truth he could not deny. This was not the end of her spirit, it was the beginning of something far greater. The chains clinked softly as she shifted, her voice low but sharp. Test me as much as you wish, human. You will learn what others have learned before you. The spirit of an Amazon cannot be owned. And with that, she turned back to the flames, leaving the commander in silence. He had taken her as a slave, but the more he tested her, the clearer it became. It was he who was being tested. The wasteland night was heavy with silence, broken only by the crackle of fire and the distant cry of scavenger beasts. The camp slept, but unease lingered, as if the shadows themselves carried whispers of danger. The Amazon sat by the fire again, her chains glowing faintly, her eyes sharp as they scanned the darkness beyond the tents. She did not sleep, she never did, for sleep was weakness, and weakness meant death. The commander was inside his tent, his armor placed beside him, his blade resting within reach. But even in rest, he remained alert, his instincts honed from years of battle. He felt the shift in the air before it came, a tension, a warning, and then the first sound, the distant thrum of enemy boots striking the sand. The attack came suddenly. Arrows of energy tore through the night sky, striking tents and sending flames into the air. Men shouted in alarm, scrambling for weapons, while others fell before they could rise. The camp erupted in chaos, the enemy soldiers storming through the firelight with blades flashing, their faces hidden behind masks of war. The commander rushed out, his blade drawn, shouting orders, his voice cutting through the panic. But the soldiers were scattered, caught in confusion, and there, in the middle of it all, the chained Amazon rose like a storm-given form. A masked warrior lunged toward her, blade raised. She twisted, pulling her chains tight around his arm, snapping it with brutal force before kicking him into the fire. Another came, and she swung her bound wrists like a weapon, the glowing cuffs smashing against his skull, sending him crashing to the ground. Even in chains, she was deadly, more dangerous than half the camp armed. The commander fought fiercely, his sword flashing in the firelight, his movements sharp and precise. But then, through the smoke and flames, an enemy warrior leapt from behind, blade aimed at his back. The soldiers nearby shouted too late. The strike would have ended him, if not for her. The Amazon lunged forward, her chains whipping across the air, striking the attacker's arm and knocking the blade aside. Before he could recover, she drove her shoulder into his chest, forcing him to the ground. Her movements were raw, wild, yet precise. She had no weapon but herself, and still she was unstoppable. The commander turned, his eyes locking on hers in the chaos. For a heartbeat, time slowed. She had saved him, not for escape, not for freedom, but because she chose to. That choice carried more weight than the battle itself. They fought side by side as the camp burned around them. His sword cut through the air, her chain struck like lightning. Together, they pushed back the attackers, step by step, their movements flowing as if they had trained for years. The soldiers, seeing this strange alliance, rallied, their fear turning into fire. By dawn, the attackers were broken, retreating into the wasteland, leaving behind their dead. The camp was torn, bodies scattered, tents burned, weapons broken, but it still stood. And so did the commander and the Amazon. She stood beside him, her chest rising with heavy breath, her chains stained with blood, her eyes unyielding. The soldiers stared, whispers rippling among them. "She saved him," one muttered. "She fought for us," another added. For the first time, they did not see her as a prisoner. They saw her as a warrior. The commander approached her, his voice low but steady. "You had your chance to escape," he said, studying her carefully. "Yet you stayed." Her lips curved into the faintest smirk, tired but proud. "I do not run," she answered. "Not from battle, not from fate." Her words echoed in him like a challenge and a truth. He looked at her not as a slave, not even as an enemy, but as an equal who had chosen to stand at his side. Something had changed forever in that moment, something no chain could explain. That night, when the fires were put out and the camp was rebuilt, she was still chained, yet no one mocked her anymore. The men who once spat at her now avoided her gaze out of respect. And when the commander looked at her, he felt a storm in his chest. She was his prisoner in name, but in truth, she had just saved his life, and that made her something else entirely. The wasteland was quiet once more, but within that quiet, a code bond had been forged, born not of chains, but of battle, not of orders, but of choice. And though neither spoke it aloud, both knew the truth. The war between them had shifted, for now, they were no longer captor and captive. They were two warriors bound by the fire of survival, and something even greater waited ahead. The battle was over, but the echoes of it clung to the camp like smoke. Men limped through the ruins of burned tents, carrying the wounded, burying the fallen, repairing what could be saved. The commander gave his orders with a steady voice, but inside, he carried the memory of one moment only, the chain striking through the fire, the Amazon standing between him and death. He could not shake the truth. She had chosen to save him. That night, the camp sat quieter than ever, the laughter gone, the firelight flickering against tired faces. The Amazon sat as always, her chains wrapped around her wrists, her body marked with bruises but her spirit unbroken. The soldiers no longer dared mock her. Instead they watched her in silence, whispering only when they thought she could not hear. She had become something else in their eyes, not just a prisoner, not just an enemy, but a warrior worthy of fear and respect. The commander approached her when the moon hung high above the wasteland. He dismissed the guards with a gesture, then placed a small flask of water and bread before her. "You fought beside me," he said quietly. "You could have left me to die, but you did not." Her eyes met his across the flames, sharp as ever, yet softer than before. "I did not fight for you," she said, her voice calm. "I fought because I choose when my battles end, not chains, not men, not fate." He studied her, the firelight dancing across her face. "You could have run when the chains loosened," he pressed. "You could be gone now." She tilted her head slightly, her braids falling against her shoulders. "And leave before I see the truth of you," she replied, her words cutting deeper than any blade. "You spared me when you could have killed me. You bound me when you could have broken me." "Why, Commander? What are you seeking in me?" Her question left him silent, for he had no answer he wished to speak aloud. He had told himself it was control, victory, dominance, but the truth was heavier, stranger, harder to name. Something in her eyes, something in her pride, kept pulling him toward her, like a blade drawn to flame. At last she spoke again, her voice low, carrying the weight of old truths. "My people do not fear death. We do not fear chains. We only fear dishonor," she said, her gaze never breaking from his. "When you spared me, you showed strength, not mercy. And strength is what my people honor above all things." Her fingers tightened on the chains, the blue light glimmering between her hands. "I stayed because I wanted to see if your strength was real, or only the mask of a man who commands others." The commander's jaw tightened, the fire crackling between them. "You call me strong, yet you sit here bound," he said slowly. "How is that strength?" Her lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "Because I am bound, yet I choose, and you cannot see which choice I will make until it is too late." The silence stretched, filled only by the hiss of fire and the cries of night beasts far in the distance. He realized then what his men could not. The chains did not hold her. Not truly. She remained because she willed it, because she had judged him, because she sought something in him as much as he sought something in her. For a long time neither spoke, only the fire moved, shadows playing across their faces. The commander felt a weight pressing on him, a truth he could no longer deny. She was not his slave, not in spirit, not even in choice. And worse, or perhaps better, he found himself no longer wanting her to be. Finally she leaned closer, her eyes glowing in the firelight. "Do you see now, human?" she whispered. "I am not here because of your chains. I am here because I wish to know what kind of man you truly are." Her words struck him harder than any blade ever had. For the first time, he did not see her as a prisoner at all, but as a mirror, reflecting the truth of his own spirit. The fire burned lower, the camp quiet, the world outside the flames forgotten, and there, between chains and silence, something unspoken bound them tighter than iron ever could. Not obedience, not conquest, but respect, sharp and dangerous. It was the kind of bond that could turn into either love or destruction, and neither of them yet knew which path fate would choose. The days after the ambush were different. The camp was no longer the same place. Men who once laughed at the Amazon now fell silent when she passed, their eyes following her with unease and respect. She had saved their commander. She had fought as one of them, and though the chains still glowed around her wrists, they no longer seemed like symbols of victory, but of defiance. The commander felt the change as well. Every time he looked at her, sitting by the fire or walking through the camp with guards at her side, he felt the weight of a choice pressing against his chest. He had claimed her as a slave, yet she had never acted like one, and now his soldiers no longer saw her as a captive, but as something greater. The balance of power in his camp was shifting, and he knew it. One night, under the pale light of the twin moons, the commander stood before her. The camp was quiet, most of the soldiers asleep, only the fire crackling between them. He carried the key to her chains in his hand, its metal cool against his palm. She watched him with steady eyes, her face calm, as if she already knew what he had come to do. Without a word, he crouched and unlocked the cuffs. The chains fell to the ground with a heavy sound, glowing faintly before fading into silence. For the first time since her capture, her wrists were free. The soldiers who had been watching from a distance gasped quietly, their whispers spreading through the shadows. The commander ignored them, his eyes fixed only on her. "You are free," he said quietly, his voice heavy but steady. Her eyes narrowed slightly, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. "Free," she repeated softly. As if testing the word on her tongue, she rose slowly, her movements graceful, her shoulders straight. And for a moment, the camp seemed to hold its breath. Would she strike him? Would she flee into the wasteland? Would she turn against him now that nothing held her back? But she did none of those things. Instead, she stood beside him, not behind, not away, but beside. Her voice carried across the campfire, calm yet sharp. "You think the chains made me stay, but it was never the chains, it was the choice." The commander held her gaze, and for the first time he spoke the truth. "And now your choice is your own." The men whispered furiously, some with fear, some with anger, but none dared to interrupt. The Amazon stepped forward, her head high, her eyes burning with pride. "I choose not to leave," she said, her voice ringing like steel. "I choose to stay and fight, but not as your slave, not as your captive, as your equal." The words struck harder than any blade. The commander felt the fire in his chest grow stronger, his heart pounding against the weight of her declaration. In front of all who watched, he nodded, his voice firm. "Then equal you will be." From that night forward, she no longer sat in chains. She walked the camp freely, Though the soldiers still watched her with cautious eyes, some feared her. Some admired her, but none could deny her presence. She trained alongside them. Her movements sharp, her strikes heavy, and even bruised and battered she remained unyielding. When she sparred, she moved like a storm, and when she stood still, she carried herself like a queen. The younger soldiers began to whisper differently. "Now, she is stronger than us," some admitted. "She is more fearless than we are," others said. Even the older veterans, hardened by years of war, found themselves bowing their heads slightly when she passed. She was no longer the prisoner of the camp. She had become its flame. The commander knew the danger in what he had done. By freeing her, he had risked everything: his authority, his men's loyalty, even his own life. But as he watched her move through the camp, free yet unyielding, he realized it was the only choice he could have made. She had never been truly bound, and now he had given that truth to all one evening. As the fire burned low, she approached him. He was sharpening his blade, the sparks glinting against the steel. She stood before him, arms crossed, her voice low but steady. "You released me, not because you trust me, but because you wanted to see if I would betray you." The commander paused, his blade still in his hand, his eyes lifting to hers. "Did you?" he asked. She leaned closer, her breath warm in the night air. "If I had wanted betrayal, you would already be dead." Her words carried no threat, only truth. The commander held her gaze, and for the first time he did not feel as though he was testing her. He felt as though she was testing him, and in that silent exchange, in the firelight between them, he realized he had passed. The camp was no longer held together by fear or chains. It was held by something far stronger: respect, forged in battle, bound by choice. The Amazon had come as a slave, but now she stood as an equal, and though neither spoke it aloud, all who watched knew that something greater was forming between them. Not just alliance, not just survival, but the first spark of a bond that could change everything. The wasteland was restless again. The silence before the storm pressed heavy against the camp, as if the air itself knew what was coming. Scouts returned with grim reports. A vast enemy army was moving across the desert, larger than any the humans had faced before. They would arrive by dawn, and when they did, the camp would burn unless the soldiers stood as one. The commander called his men together, their armor dented, their blades worn, but their eyes fixed on him with loyalty. He gave his orders with clarity, his voice steady even as the weight of the coming battle pressed against him. But when his gaze moved across the crowd, it found her, the Amazon, standing tall at the edge of the firelight, her presence stronger than steel. She was no longer bound, no longer a prisoner, and the soldiers knew it, yet none dared to speak against her. That night, before the battle, the commander stood alone at the ridge overlooking the wasteland. The sand stretched wide, the horizon glowing faintly with the fires of the approaching army. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see her, walking with the same fierce grace she had carried since the day he captured her. "You should be with the men," he said quietly. She shook her head, her eyes never leaving the horizon. "I should be with you." Her words carried no softness, only truth. He looked at her, remembering the first night he had chained her, the fire in her eyes, the defiance in her silence. Now she stood beside him by choice, unchained, unbroken, equal for a moment. He allowed himself to feel what he had hidden: respect, trust, and something stronger than both. And in the firelight of the camp, he realized the truth. She was no longer his prisoner. She was his ally, his partner, his destined bond. When dawn came, the wasteland shook with the march of the enemy. The commander stood at the front line, his blade gleaming in the rising sun. And beside him, the Amazon took her place, her hair braided back, her armor repaired, her eyes sharp with unshakable resolve. The soldiers behind them stared in awe, whispering as the impossible became real. Their commander and his once prisoner now stood together as equals. The enemy poured forward, a sea of blades and fire. The clash came like thunder, steel striking steel, voices crying out in fury and pain. The commander fought with the precision of a veteran, his blade cutting through the storm, but it was she who moved like a force of nature, her strikes fast and brutal, her presence unshakable. Together, they carved a path through the chaos. Side by side, their movements flowing as if bound by something greater than war. At the height of the battle, when the enemy pushed hardest, the Amazon raised her voice. Not to the commander, not to the soldiers, but to all who fought. "This man is not my master," she shouted, her voice ringing across the battlefield. "This man is my equal, and I fight as his bride. Not his slave." The words struck the men like fire. The soldiers roared, their strength renewed, their fear burned away by the force of her declaration. The commander himself felt his chest tighten, the truth of her words cutting deeper than any wound. She had chosen him, not in defeat, not in chains, but in freedom. The battle turned, the humans rallying behind the bond they had witnessed. Every strike carried new power, every step new courage. By the time the sun reached its peak, the wasteland was littered with the bodies of their enemies. The human camp still stood, scarred but unbroken, its warriors bloodied but alive. When the last blade fell silent, the commander stood at the center of the battlefield. The Amazon stood beside him, her armor cracked, her body bruised, but her spirit blazing brighter than ever. The men gathered around, their voices chanting, their eyes filled with something they had not felt in years, hope. And though no priest, no crown, no ritual bound them, everyone knew what had been forged that day. She had been taken as a slave, but she had chosen to stay as his equal. She had fought beside him as a warrior, but she had spoken as his bride, and in that truth, the chains of war had been broken, replaced by a bond no blade could sever. As the firelight of victory burned into the night, the commander and the Amazon stood together, not master and slave, not enemy and prisoner, but partners, bound by choice. The camp whispered her new name, not slave, not Amazon, but the bride of war. And so their story began anew, no longer written in chains, but in freedom, in respect, and in a love forged in the heart of battle.